Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. This is another video on Laravel. Okay, so still kind of setting up everything in Laravel for our little list project. Okay, so the last thing we kind of made it in the database, we set up our routes. Now, show you a couple other tools just so you know. You can run a command like this. So see here, it says PHP artisan make controller. So the idea is we made our model. We made, well, not our model. We made our database table, which was list. And the thing is that we need to make routes that'll create and add things to this list thing, and those routes need stuff to do, which is in our controller. Okay, so PHP artisan make controller list controller. So it's going to make a controller file called list controller. Now, this resource flag here basically says, hey, this has to do with the database about adding and subtracting and editing. So it's going to create all the routes you need. So your whole CRUD routes that you would normally make, it'll just basically build that out for you right here. Now, there's two ways to interact with your database in Laravel. You could either just do straight up interacting with the database object and do SQL queries, which I'll show you in a second, or you can use a model, okay, which then you can use what's called Eloquent ORM, which is built into Laravel to interact with your database. So if you want to use Eloquent ORM, you can use this model flag to create a model called list. Okay, so I've already ran this command and the model was created successfully. But basically what it does is going to do two things. It creates, well, this model folder, so it's going to be in your app folder in your application. Okay, so essentially there's your list model and then the default user model that it comes with. And you don't really need to, only thing you really need to do is associate this with a table in your database, which the code for that should be all the way up at the top of here on the, and this is under the Eloquent ORM section of the documentation. Okay. So that's towards the top here, yep. Okay, so we associate the table by doing this little piece of code here. So let me do that right now. Okay. And the table is called underscore list. If I remember right. I don't think I got my PHP server, my MySQL server on right now for me to go check that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was. Okay. Cool. So then that would associate with a list. So in that case, from going forward, now I'd be able to interact with the database. Let me scroll down so you can see little snippets of code. Like here. So let me find a good example. Boop, 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 boop. Okay. So for example, this is like a flight model, and you're interacting with it in your code. So you're saying, hey, flight restore, hey, do here I'm looking, look at the history, get the trash stuff. Oh, here you're doing a query, so flights with the stuff that's trashed, you know, find me a item where account ID is 1, go get it. Okay, you could do it that way. Okay, you don't have to do it that way. It just makes it more semantic, so that way I know, okay, this is the table I'm getting it from, and you don't necessarily need to like learn SQL top to bottom to do this. You could not do that, not set up a model, and just interact with a database by setting up normal queries. Yes, all this information is going to be inside the database section of your of the Laravel documentation. Okay, and you can do stuff like this. So essentially here, what we're saying here is the data. We're going to look at the database, and we're going to go look up a table called users. Okay, I think there was a good example over here that showed you like a standard SQL query. That's just connecting to the database. Here we go. So like DB select. So then here's like the text of the SQL query. So select all from the users table where active equals question mark, and then here's the value that's filling in the question mark. So it essentially identifies these question marks and then fills it in with these values in the second parameter. So either way, you could interact with the database. But if you want, you can use the model, and then you have that sort of facade to interact with. But on top of creating the model, it also creates the controller. So if you go to HTTP, controllers, here's my list controller. And since I had that resource flag, it created a route for all of them: index, create, store, show, edit, update, destroy. Now, of course, there's not really anything going on in these routes right now. You have to still build out the logic, but you have it all scoped out for you. And it has like the parameter built in for you. So like, again, if you wanted to like basically this one is edit. So if you want to edit, it'll take a list and then take a variable which will include the ID of that list. And then like here, if you're going to update, it has a parameter for the request body, and then again the ID of the list object. And then here, if you want to create one, so technically the create route would take you to a page with the form, and then you'd submit the form, and then you'd store it with this route. And this has the request body in it, so that way you could store the form. So it has a lot of that sort of scoped out and built for you, which is really nice, and saves a lot of time. And then another really cool piece is that when you set up the route, you don't have to set up a route for each individual CRUD controller. So let's go back, because what you can do is you can use this syntax over here. It's going to be towards the bottom. Routes. Actually, I have it in API. So right here. So instead of saying like route get or route post, you can just create one route : API resource or resource. So the difference is if I just wrote resource after it, it would use all the routes, expecting that it'd have like a page for create and whatnot. Since this is in the API routes, because I'm creating an API and then I'm going to just pull it in from the front end, what API does, it only connects to the routes you would need for an API. So I don't need a create route because I'm not taking them to a page where they fill out the form. That's going to be done through the API request. They'll submit that in. Instead, I'll create a front end form through a single page application, and I'll make an AJAX request with the appropriate request body. So in that case, this would just pull out the right routes, and it's basically connecting to it's going to be called list. So basically the route will be /list, and then what the routes do is going to be based on the list controller. So if I do like API, if I do like /list and then an ID, it'll treat it differently depending on whether it's like a put request or a delete request. Why? Because that's all defined in my controller that we saw up here a second ago. Okay, it already knows what to do. So when it sees that, it already maps it to it. And it's going to show you how it maps it. Let me go back to the docs. It's going to be in the basics, in controllers. There's a lot of cool things controllers can do. But for our particular purpose, that's sort of one of the most useful things. Let me go to where it says talks about resource controllers. Here we go, resource controllers. Where's that little chart? Here we go. So this is like what it automatically sets up for you. So if someone makes a get request, so it would be like get lists. It would run that index function from those routes we created from that controller. Get, and you guys get the idea. So this really kind of saves you a lot of time in kind of figuring out the structure. I thought that was a really nice feature. Now last time I was having a trouble with this test controller here. And it turns out what the problem was, the controller was fine. The problem was in the route. I had a typo here. It said test controller. And for some reason, no matter how hard I looked, and you guys saw how I was like inspiring, so you might have seen the typo and just looked at me being also looking for that typo, but that's what was causing the error. So generally, again, if you see that error of like controller doesn't exist, it's either a subdirectory issue, meaning you didn't specify a subdirectory you put in your controller into, if it's in that controllers folder. It could be a typo, or a syntax error in the controller. Those are sort of the three causes of that error from all the research. Save you some stress on that regard. So at some point, I'm gonna spin my SQL server and my PHP server back up so we can test the API. But theoretically, we are at the initial steps of having all this stuff set up. I just have to create the logic for those routes, and then we test out the API, and then we'll have the API which we can create a front-end application for. But I will get back to you in the next video, and we'll explore that more. So see you guys then. Ciao.